Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. This podcast is designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know, all in 20 minutes. I am your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Like what you hear? Then please rate and review on Apple or Google Podcasts. And thank you to all of you who have left a review. It is very much appreciated. We drop an episode every Friday. So if you want the latest episode in your inbox, then please go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast, where you can add your details to the emailed list. We only email you about our podcasts and we do not share your data with anyone else. So get that cup of tea, put your feet up and enjoy. The 23rd of April is St. George's Day, and St. George is the patron saint of England. In 2019, I was invited to talk about St. George at the Feast of St. George celebrations, organised by the Mayor of London in Trafalgar Square, and also a bit of a treasure hunt for families. But alas, for the second year in a row, we aren't able to celebrate together. St. George and his dragon are woven into the very fabric of London, and you'll find references to him all over town. So I thought that I would share with you some of the best St. George's Day themed places in London which you can visit yourselves, and if you're overseas, don't worry, I have photos and videos for you in the show notes. First up though, a little about the man himself, St. George. Who was St. George? George had followed in his father's footsteps and joined the army. He quickly rose through the ranks and became a tribune and later a count. He became a member of Roman Emperor Diocletian's personal guard. When is St. George's Day? Today, 23rd of April, and it's been dedicated to St. George for the last 799 years since the year 1222. And why is St. George's Day on the 23rd of April? Well, that's the day he died. How did St. George die? In 303 AD, Emperor Diocletian ordered the systematic persecution of Christians across the Roman Empire. George was ordered to take part in the persecution. Don't forget, he's a soldier. But instead, he confessed to being a Christian himself and criticised the imperial decision. As news spread of his rebellion against the persecutions, George realised as both Diocletian and Galerius were in the city, it would not be long before he was arrested. He prepared for the event by disposing of his property to the poor, and he freed his slaves. Enraged, Diocletian ordered the torture and beheading of George, and George was beheaded in Nicomedia, an ancient city which is now in Turkey, on 23rd of April 303. Christians soon honoured St. George as a martyr. A number of churches have been built in his honour in Lydda, a small Palestinian city now known as Lod, which lies just east of Tel Aviv, and that was the home of George's mother. And his veneration spread throughout Palestine and the Roman Empire. So why is St. George the patron saint of England? Well, devotion to St. George became popular in Europe in about the 10th century. He was a popular early Christian martyr elsewhere in Christendom and was the patron saint of soldiers, which makes sense given his profession. However, St. George became the patron saint of England in the 15th century, when in 1415 AD, Henry V won the Battle of Agincourt. And you might remember, "Cry God for Harry, England and St. George," said by King Henry in Henry V by Shakespeare. And those overseas might be surprised to learn that St. George's Day is not a public holiday. Now, why not? And that's a good question. Well, it used to be. St. George's Day was once celebrated in England as widely as Christmas, but it seems to have waned after England had united with Scotland on the 1st of May 1707. There has been in recent times a push involving campaigns and petitions to make the day a public holiday in England, as St Andrew's Day is in Scotland. And did St George ever come to England? The short answer, no. He was the personal guard to Emperor Diocletian, who never came to England, so why would George have needed to? And having a little dig around to try and find a more comprehensive answer, I think the question comes from a song, originally a poem that we now know as Jerusalem, but was actually called And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time, which was written by Londoner poet and painter and printmaker William Blake, born in Soho, buried in Bunhill Fields, and it was printed in about 1808. But it wasn't until 1916 when musician Hubert Parry, born in Bournemouth, lived in Kensington, set the words to music. And it was Sir Edward Elgar, born in Worcestershire, lived in Kensington, who did the orchestration that we know and love now, and it's often considered the unofficial national anthem for England. And if I sang it, you'd know it. It was played at the royal wedding in 2011 and is often sang at the last night of the proms. I've added YouTube clips to the show notes for both of those examples. And also, if you want to know more about the history of the proms and the Royal Albert Hall, then you can listen to episode 17. It's plenty enough to keep you entertained. So saying all of this about St George, you may be surprised there's actually only one statue of St George in London, and it's not really even that accessible. It's on a traffic island in front of the neoclassical Georgian church of St John's Wood. This is the same church where in 1969 Paul and Linda McCartney had their marriage blessings, and it's just across the way from Lord's Cricket Ground. It's a familiar scene, a bronze-mounted St George astride his rearing horse, striking a dragon which seems to be desperately clinging to the base of the bronze. It's not a new statue, it was unveiled in 1930, but I suppose being in the middle of a very busy traffic island, don't really get the time to stand and look and appreciate this, and the sculpture is C.L. Hartnell. If you do wish to go and see it in person, the nearest stations are St John's Wood or Marylebone, and I'll put a link in the show notes there. And St George has associations with fortitude, courage and patriotism based on the memorable story of him slaying a dragon. So it's understandable why so many London pubs had been named in his honour. It seems, though, that St George has become a bit more fashionable, as many pubs have been renamed, such as the glorious Victorian pub and dining rooms once known as the George and the Dragon, which is on St John Street in Clerkenwell, and now named the Peasant, supposedly after the Peasants' Revolt. The pub may be renamed, but the beautiful white stone relief decorations with roundels bearing the figure of St George are still prominent on the outside. It has some of the original internal fittings as well, and there's a decorative mosaic floor throughout, with the original pub name in the former lobby area. And there's a gorgeous coloured tile panel on the left of the entrance too, showing St George slaying the dragon, which was restored after World War II bomb damage. There have been a handful of London churches dedicated to St George, and one that's still up, and I could certainly recommend the trip, is St George in the East. It's a wonderful Grade 1 listed building in Limehouse, built between 1714 and 1729, and is one of Hawksmoor's 6 London churches, Nicholas Hawksmoor being a leading English Baroque architect. And this church is done in neoclassical style, but has Palladian and Byzantine elements. Unfortunately, Hawksmoor's original interior was destroyed by fire during the Blitz, but the walls and the distinctive pepper pot towers still remain. And then in 1964, a modern church interior was constructed inside those existing walls and a new flat built under each corner tower. And the architectural critic Ian Nairn wrote about St George in the East. He said, "A ruin among ruins in the lost part of Stepney after the Blitz and before being blitzed by the Borough Council. The old life has gone. The new has yet to come. It makes no difference to Hawksmoor's bizarre poetry. This is probably the hardest building to describe in London. This is a stage somewhere beyond fantasy. It is the more than real world of the drug addict's dream." I get the feeling he didn't quite like it. One of the other St George London churches is St George's in Bloomsbury, one of the 12 new churches designed and paid for under the 1711 Act of Parliament for building 50 new churches, and the 6th and final London church designed by none other than our friend Hawksmoor. The church was surrounded by one of London's most notorious slums, St Giles. William Hogarth's Gin Lanes, 1751, clearly shows the easily identified spire of St George's, Bloomsbury, highlighting the evident squalor and despair that characterised the area. In 1913, St George's Church was the setting for the funeral for Emily Davidson, the suffragette who threw herself under the King's horse Anma in the 1913 Epsom Derby. The funeral was organised by the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst, with 6,000 women marchers, then brass bands played by Chopin's Funeral March. There was also a banner showing Joan of Arc and 3 laurel wreaths placed on her coffin with the words, "She died for women." One protester threw a brick at the coffin. The cortege moved on to King's Cross Station and then to Morpeth for the burial in her family grave. The third and final London church I'd like to mention is St George's in Hanover Square, Mayfair, another one of the 1711 Act of Parliament churches, but this time the architect chosen for the project was John James, one of Sir Christopher Wren's assistants. The most famous parishioner at St George's, Hanover Square, was the composer Georg Friedrich Handel in the early 1700s. I have attended many a wonderful Handel-themed concerts here over the years, thanks to Handel and Hendrix in London, soon to reopen, I may add. Many notable weddings have taken place here, including that of poet Shelley to Harriet Westbrook in 1814, and also for Benjamin Disraeli, 1839, and the future US President Theodore Roosevelt in 1886. Happily, this church survived the Blitz and still has its original interior. You could argue that if Handel walked back into the church nowadays, he would be most familiar with the interior. So I've talked a bit about George. What about the fun stuff? Where are the dragons? Well, they are all over London. The obvious candidate is the City of London, but there are dragons across London, including in the coats of arms of London boroughs such as Brent, Bromley and Wandsworth. I'll share the links to images in the show notes. The London Borough of Brent was formed by the amalgamation of the Borough of Wembley and the Borough of Willesden, and Brent's coats of arms show a golden lion holding the shield as well as a blue dragon with rather funky-looking red nails. Bromley's coat of arms was created in the 1960s when 5 councils merged, and the coat of arms shows a white unicorn holding a shield with a white dragon. 2 dragons are featured in the coat of arms of Wandsworth. The first is a black dragon with outstretched wings with 4 red crosses on its underwing. It stands holding the shield with a blue dove, wings also outstretched with 5 golden mullets on its underwing. And mullets isn't a bad hairdo, they're heraldic terminology for stars. And the dove also has a sprig of lavender in its mouth. And the second dragon is less obvious, and it's a lot smaller, and it's on the prow of the sailing ship. But the coat of arms for all the boroughs of London with the most dragons is, yes indeed, the City of London. The shield combines the cross of St. George with the emblem of the city's patron, St. Paul, who, according to tradition, was martyred by being beheaded by said weapon. It is therefore likely that the city's shield, from its combination of the cross of St. George with the sword of St. Paul, was intended to symbolise England and London, its capital, the first cathedral having been dedicated to St. Paul in 605 AD. There's no record of any grant of arms having ever been made to the city. And the shield, in fact, was in use 100 years before the incorporation of the College of Arms in 1483. It is, however, recognised as authentic by the College of Arms, and we do cover the wonderful College of Arms in our Best of Blackfriars tour. Some people don't think the dagger is of St. Paul. They think it is representative of the dagger with which Sir William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, stabbed the rebel Wat Tyler at Smithfield in 1381 during the Peasants' Revolt. But this is inconsistent with the fact that the coat of arms was used before Tyler's death. The origin of the crest and supporters is to be found in the 16th century. 1539, it first appeared on the reverse of the common seal. At first, the crest consisted of a fan-like object charged with the cross of St. George, but by 1677, the fan had come to be mistaken for a dragon's wing, and early in the 17th century, the corporation invented a pair of dragon supporters to match it. Now, maybe the introduction of the dragons could have been influenced by the legend of St. George, and the city shield and that of St. George of England being the same, though the former had the sword of St. Paul's in addition to the cross. Who knows? There is no official record. As you wander around the perimeter of the City of London, you may notice that there are indeed dragons guarding the city, and they mark out the different gates around the city. Aldersgate, Bishopsgate, Temple Bar, Bridgegate and Moorgate, etc. And dragons have been used in stories to protect something. So think of Smaug in J.R.R. Tolkien's novel The Hobbit. He protects Erebor for himself. And maybe the City of London is being protected by these dragons. So we already looked in episode 1 of how the City of London is the original heart of London, having been established by the Romans. But the dragons, they're not a Roman thing. Not in London, at any rate. 2 of the original dragon statues were from the Coal Exchange. These dragons lived under the entrance of the Coal Exchange in Lower Thames Street until that was demolished in 1863, and then they took up residence on either side of the Victoria Embankment. If you'd like to have a look at some of the dragons in the City of London yourself, then you are more than welcome to download my free Top 10 Dragons in the City of London guide. And there's a map and there's brief descriptions of the dragons for you to go and have a little look. And you know, this is fun for adults, fun for families. Just get out and explore the city while it's quiet and there are no tourists around. So you can get that download on the episode show notes at londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast and then click on episode 52. Or if you want a little bit of a personal touch, then get on the website and book yourself a private walking tour with me where we will uncover the dragons of London. No matter which method you choose, I hope you have a fabulous time exploring the dragons of London. And if you do get out and about, then why not post on Twitter or Instagram and tag us of the dragons in London that you see. That's all for this week. We'll see you next time.